This video is part of the CCT Routing and Switching curriculum. It comes from section 4 of that curriculum, and the title is Identifying Loopback Plugs. My name is Keith Bogart, and I will be your instructor for this video. This video is going to be really short. We're going to be focusing just on one bullet point in section 4 of that blueprint, which is namely, identify the correct different loopback plugs. That's all we're going to do, identify loopback plugs. So, first of all, loopback testing. Why would we do loopback testing? What problem is solved? Well, I think this is pretty self-explanatory right here. Sometimes when you're troubleshooting line errors, in other words, nothing's getting through this port, or what's getting through is all garbage, or maybe the port isn't even coming up, you might have in your mind, okay, could it be one of these three things? Is it possible there's a problem with my local NIC card itself? Maybe the hardware of the NIC is damaged. Maybe some of the pins are bent or broken. Maybe the internal wiring has separated from some of the pins. Maybe you have an internal memory issue or error, something like that. So I want to test that. How do I test that my local NIC card is actually okay? Is there a problem with the cable connected to my NIC? You know, maybe you've, how do you test that? Is the problem with the telco's line equipment? Okay, maybe it's not my NIC card or my wire going to the wall jack, but maybe it's from the wall jack to the telco. Maybe it's something in their line, or maybe it's something at their end. So by doing loopback testing, it can help answer these problems. Now, what's loopback testing? Loopback testing is real simple. It really just involves, normally when you transmit something, it goes out the transmit pin of your NIC card, along the transmit wire strand within that cable, and eventually it hits like a receive pin somewhere else, like a receive pin maybe at the wall jack where that cable's connected to. There's a receive pin there, and then it goes out the transmit pin, it hits the receive pin at the telco's location. Or if we're talking about two switches connected back to back, same thing. Transmit pin on the RJ45 jack goes to the transmit wire, which ends up in the receive wire here, and the receive pin in this NIC card. So loopback testing is simply saying, look, I'm not going to allow my signal to go all the way from end to end. Somewhere in that process, I'm going to loop it back. I'm going to loop it back to myself. And if that's successful, I know that from here to the point where I did the loop back, at least that part is okay. The problem must be somewhere beyond where I did my test. So there's a couple of different kinds of loopback tests. The one that we see here on the top is what's called a soft loopback. Not all interface types support this, but if you get into your interface, if it supports some kind of a loopback command, for example, if you go into an Ethernet interface and you type in loopback, you should see that's a supported command. What's that doing? That's internally within the software that's saying, okay, when I'm sending something to this NIC card, send it back to myself. So you're not changing the hardware characteristics at all. It's what's called a software loopback. You're getting the software to talk to itself. And then there's other types of tests which are called hard loopbacks and telco-assisted loopbacks. Now, for the purposes of this video, because we're talking about ultimately, what's our objective here? The objective in that bullet point is to identify loopback plugs. Well, a loopback plug is a physical device, and all we need to do is identify it. So we're going to be talking about hard loopbacks here. Now, let me take a step back for a moment. This video is for the CCT Routing and Switching exam. Why is that important? Well, because it says identify loopback plugs. Notice what it doesn't say. The bullet point doesn't say understand how to use loopback plugs, understand the correct test to implement with a loopback plug. So I'm making the assumption here that because it's saying identify loopback plug, you are like a field engineer or something, and you're going out to a site and you're on the phone with the Cisco TAC or some other kind of engineer. It's the Cisco TAC's responsibility to figure out what types of tests to do the troubleshooting. So you're out on site and they're telling you something like, okay, we're going to need to do a loopback test. I need you to find an RJ45 Ethernet loopback, or I need you to find a T1 loopback or a fiber loopback. So it's just simply your job to look in your bag of all your equipment and pull out a plug that matches what they're asking for and plug it in the port. It's not your job to implement the test or to know what test has to be run. That's why it says identify. So with the last three or four slides here, I just want to show you what these loopback plugs look like So if you ever see pictures of them, or if you have a bag full of these plugs, you can identify one from another. You can differentiate them from another. All right, the first kind. Well, if we need to perform a hard loopback test on an RJ45 port of an Ethernet NIC card. All right, well, here you see on the left, this is what the pinout's going to have to be. So you can see pin 1 is going to be looped back to pin 3, pin 2 is going to be looped back to pin 6, and so your actual plug will look somewhat like on the right. You want to make sure that the pinouts, the wires, are correctly looped back to each other like you see here. So that's what an RJ45 Ethernet loopback plug looks like. Well, what if I have a fast or gigabit Ethernet interface that's doing fiber? It's not doing RJ45. Well, there are loopback plugs for that too. You can see here the whole concept is going to be the same across the board. Whatever's being transmitted is looped back to the receive, and other transmit pins have to be looped back to other receive pins. So here we see a fiber loopback connector. Main thing to remember here is that there's different kinds of fiber. There's single mode fiber and multi-mode fiber. So ensure that whatever loopback plug you're selecting is appropriate for the fiber interface. So you should know, okay, this switch port or this router interface, which is fiber, is supporting multi-mode fiber, single mode fiber. So I need to get a loopback plug that supports that. There are some adapters that are both, that support both single mode fiber and multi-mode fiber in one adapter. So just make sure you do the correct type. And the last one, actually no, there's two more. What about a T1 loopback plug? T1s typically plug into jacks that look very similar to RJ45, but they're called RJ48C. So visually they look similar, but the pinout is different. So you can see here on the left, this for an RJ48C, this is what your loopback pinout needs to look like. And if this is of interest to you, you might want to pause this video and write down that pinout and memorize that, you know, pin 5 goes to pin 2, pin 1 goes to pin 4. And then you see there on the right an example of what that type of plug might look like. Once again, a lot of these loopback plugs you can purchase, but a lot of websites I've seen, people have just made their own. They just taken a cable, cut off the end, stripped some of the outer sheath, and just twisted the wires together themselves. Might just be cheaper and easier for you to do it that way. And the last type I want to talk about is an RS-232 serial cable loopback. And as we know, RS-232 comes in many different form factors. Here we see a couple of them. So we see what the DB9 loopback looks like, and we see what the DB25 loopback looks like. Main point, main takeaway from all this stuff is to memorize what pin is connected to what other pin. Because sometimes when you're visually looking at the plug, you won't be able to tell. There might not be any indicator on there that's a loopback plug, and you'll have to take something off and actually look at how the wires are connected to know if it is truly indeed a loopback plug. And for the purposes of the exam, they'll probably want you to know that, you know, this pin connects to this pin and this pin connects to this pin if we're talking about T1 versus RJ45 on Ethernet. So that concludes this video on identifying loopback plugs.